Moving on, as the 5G plus era unfolds, the telecommunications industry faces both significant regulatory changes and exciting opportunities. The introduction of 5G technology brings transformative potential, offering ultra-fast connectivity, low latency, and the capacity to support millions of devices. However, unlocking these benefits requires navigating complex regulatory landscapes. Moving on to our next panel discussion, navigating regulatory changes and opportunities in the 5G plus era. I would now like to invite our panelists on stage for this. Our first panelist, Ms. Anjali Hans, EVP Regulatory, CSR and External Communications Head, Vodafone India. May I have you on stage, ma'am? Our second panelist, Jaspreet Singh, Partner and Leader, Clients and Markets Advisory Services, and GCC Leader, Grand Thornton, Bharat. Mr. Vinish Bawa, Partner and Telecom Sector Leader, PwC India. Lieutenant General Anil Kumar Bhatt, Retired Director General, Indian Space Association. Sandeep Girotra, Vice Chairman, DIPA. Mr. Sandeep, can I have you stage? And the session will be moderated by Prasanto K. Roy, Senior Advisor, FTI Consulting, and former Editor-in-Chief, CyberMedia. A great round of applause for the panelists, please. Over to you, Prasanto.
Thank you so much. Post-lunch session, short of time, and a strong panel, tough fun. So we'll jump straight in. Regulatory challenges. We've heard quite a bit in the day about the kind of changes and the direction that technology has been taking, the applications, the huge changes driven by the post-5G or the 5G and post-5G era. Regulatory challenges, I mean, they've been there since the beginning of time, and we've, for the longest, we've worked with an 1880s Telecommunication Act, which has been revised and refreshed and so on, and that's finally sort of super refreshed. But the challenges, of course, not just remain, they're newer ones usually, and especially with the changes. So I think what I'm going to do is, just in terms of the context, so the kind of things that we are looking at obviously are the fact that there's a whole bunch of contextual changes in the environment. One is a shift to software, and we've seen more and more of that shift, already in the 4G, 5G side, and a lot of the base stations and other equipment, is not so much the hardware, it's the software. So therefore, when we actually struggle now with things like cybersecurity, and we have directives like NSDTS, which has come in, and the NCSC actually wants a statement of origin for the trusted product certification for every component. But what do you do about the software? How do you handle that? How can you handle the veracity of OTA updates, even if you've verified that all your equipment is from trusted sources? That's one contextual environmental issue. Net zero transitions, clearly there'll be a huge thrust. India is committed to a net zero by 2070, which means a lot of intermediate steps. What do we do for the telecom industry, which is obviously not just with the data centers and equipment, but the towers? How do you kind of align on that thrust? So these are two examples, but what I'm going to do is just quickly ask the panel for just introductory, 1 to 2 minute comments, because we want to get straight away into the discussion. And I'd like you to also pitch in with your questions and inputs. So if I may, in no particular order, Anjali, could I ask you first as the lady on the panel? Thank you.
Thanks, Prasanto. So regulatory framework is always the basis, I think, before you move on to anything. And when it comes to 5G, it's the moment you start understanding the rules, the game changes, so then you need a new framework. But before I come to the framework which is conducive to 5G per se, I'd like to talk a little bit about, just having that infrastructure in place for having, the services to be offered. And for that, it is, the rollout of infrastructure and the availability of service. The government, of course, has been working, very hard. And we've come out with the new Telecom Act in December of 23. And currently, they are consulting on the rules for implementation. some of the key rules that have already been notified and which are important from the point of view of infrastructure is the right-of-way rules. Now, that is something which will give right-of-way permissions legal enforceability across states. You know, we've had to struggle a lot with the rollout of our infrastructure in terms of permissions, in terms of charges, in terms of delays, and now coming to, you know, in the case of 5G, when you have small cells, this would get aggravated or accentuated even more. So these rules are indeed very timely and very welcome because they lay down an exact framework that will be applicable uniformly across India. So the rules are out, the implementation is yet to happen. The second interesting development is the Digital Bharat Nidhi rules, where the USO fund has been renamed as DBN. But one of the key new additions in those rules is that they have provided that infrastructure set up using universal service funds will be equally available in an open and non-discriminatory manner to all operators and their subscribers. So purely from a point of view of availability of the service, I think these two rules will make sure that infrastructure can be rolled out faster and it will be available for subscribers to access ubiquitously, at least in terms of the universal service infra. One challenge that still remains is with respect to the demand side. The demand side, I'm talking about the handsets and the entry barrier, where customers, there are still a lot of subscribers who are on 2G. They don't have access to smartphones, and therefore the whole digital revolution is passing them by. So we need to look at solutions. There have been some options which have been spoken about, subsidy, upgrading, etc. So the jury is still out on how do we get it, but both from a demand as well as a supply side, you know, you need to attack it in a more comprehensive and, you know, from both sides. So that's it from the infra thing. I'll talk more about the framework and other things in a bit.
So I think that's a very interesting set of three diverse areas and points. I mean, the right-of-way thing is particularly interesting because, you know, in some of the other areas where I work in public policy with energy, for example, we keep citing telecom as an example where they've cracked the problems of shared infrastructure, right-of-way. Right-of-way we are struggling with in pipelines, you know, for hydrogen and gas and so on. And we're saying that, okay, maybe telecom, you can converge. And who has rights of way? Railways has rights of way. So railways, you know, they lay fiber. Gas Authority of India's right of way, so they lay fiber. So that's an interesting dimension, actually, convergence of regulation on this. We'll come to it if we have time. Jaspreet, could we have your points in?
Thanks for having me here. I think since morning, superb deliberations. The previous speaker said 5G is here. If I was worried about 3 weeks ago with the advent of technology, I'm scared now. With what happened in the pagers attack, right, about a week ago, which makes, you know, everything from a consumer electronics perspective vulnerable to cyber attacks. And that's the perspective that I was coming from. Pick up any smart vehicle, forget smartphones, smart vehicles which come with chips. Each of those chips at a minimum have about 10,000 vulnerabilities. Who's testing them, who's certifying them, who's looking at their security? And it's not only a one-time process which goes through a common criteria lab testing, right? It's those updates that you install. We all saw what happened with CrowdStrike, right? One small update and it literally brought the entire world to its knees. Now imagine a scenario, 2035, where your alarm clock talks to your car, which in turn talks to your petrol station, which in turn checks your emails, and everybody is on 5G, all in sync. One small change, and you can actually somebody can actually bring your whole life to your knees. More about it later.
So I think that's again an interesting point from this, from the supply chain point of view. What you cited was involved a supply chain attack because at some point those pages were intercepted and explosives. We are, seeing supply chain focus in terms of the cybersecurity veracity and verification also, which is what this origin thing is about. So I'm just wondering if it will bring in a whole lot of other things when you convert cybersecurity with the telecom and all connected devices. And of course, there are concerns about anything that communicates, including aircraft, aircraft systems potentially. You had the 737 MAX things happening, not because of an external cyber attack, but because, So that's an interesting point to actually consider. And I'm sure the NCSC would be really looking at this issue of across the supply chain side.
Yeah, I think traditionally it's been more about the device in my lab and hardware testing. How do we change that to more software testing and more things like escrow agreements in place? How do I test it? How do I test patch updates? Very, very important. Nobody.
And on an ongoing basis.
On an ongoing
one
basis.
time.
Yeah, not a one
Absolutely.
time.
Yeah. Super. Vinish, can I come to you?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me change the dimension over here on two different topics. One is around, we spoke about 5G usage, 5G monetization is always a challenge. So the whole adoption of 5G in the industries. Now, there's a fact that India probably is still very slow in the adoption of 5G on the enterprises side. In Africa probably has more mines connected than in India, right? There are more ports connected in Latin America than in India. Why is that? Now, the whole clarity on captive networks, private networks, the regulations around it, who gets the spectrum, how easy it is to get the spectrum. The service providers obviously have that leverage of, using that spectrum to lease it out. But is it simplified? Is the regulations really crystal clear around it? I think that's something to be looked into, and hand on heart, it probably is not. It needs further simplification. It further needs, the industries to get some way of simplifying this so that adoption increases. All Dharmendra spoke about, all the really nice use cases, which is true, it is factual, it will happen. It's happening globally a lot, but adoption in India is still very slow. That's a fact. So how do we increase it? There is potential, there is so many industries, it has to grow. So this whole regulation around the spectrum and the usability and getting adoption of this 5G captive networks needs to further be crystallized more. So that's one. Two, I think we have heard the Indian government has done great stuff around Make in India. There's so many companies coming around Make in India, homegrown companies, etc., which are there. But then what about the multinationals who are investing so much over here, who are making factories over here? This whole thing around the content, value addition that they need to do for different products, I think that balance still needs to be there. I think there's some work to be done, and it's not easy for the regulators to define that. But that's another area to be, it's still a bit gray because, to be fair, there is all the Indian companies which are doing great, but then there are also the multinationals who are investing a lot of people, a lot of manufacturing plants over here, but they are not, qualified because of the content thing. So that needs some simplification, some more regulatory, discussion need to happen as industries together. I think great steps by the new minister of getting consultations done and a lot of, forums are there. So, but still work needs to be done. I think these are the 2 points I think I would just wanted to read on regulatory.
Yeah, so when we come back, I want to just pick up on the second one, where in terms of localization content, and this is a problem we are facing across technology, telecom, etc., because obviously very high, especially for public procurement, high value, being given to localization. But if you look at IP, for example, where in telecom, again, a very high portion of the value is being given to local IP. And how practical is that for, because the idea, of course, is to increase the amount of sort of IP here, domestic IP here, patents here, and R&D here, and all of that. But is it practical? Because I know that global, not telcos, but telecom equipment manufacturers are struggling with this question, that should we, how practical is it for us to move our IP to India, to patent it here, and then start manufacturing it here? And it's not one product, right? Any of them has, 1,000 SKUs on one variant of products. So I'm going to come back on that question. General Bhatt, you bring a different perspective from the space side, so would love to.
So before I talk of space, I'll take you back to my experience. And this goes back to 84. And it's a compliment to all of you who are sitting here as to how communication has taken us where it has. As a young captain, I walked for 2 days in snow, crossed a pass, reached a place where there was connectivity to the mainland, that is Delhi, and wherever, got a call through to my home, and lo behold, the telephone at my home was not working. So those times it used to be PP, some neighbor whose number you had. And then I rang up at that number, asked them to get my mother. She came on the phone, and then in nearly 70 hours, I could talk to her. And the change is now. Before I was retiring, from Sachin base, I could talk to my daughter in Amsterdam. This is the change all of us have experienced, and terrestrial communication, mobile communication has been a very, very major part of it. Fortunately, now I have come to the front end of it, and that is sat communication. Because satellite communication will fulfill those gaps where fiber or terrestrial communication cannot come. And if we have to take everything, the speaker who spoke before us and told us about all what we could do with 5G, all of that is possible in a large part of India if satellite communication also cooperates and complements what the terrestrial communication is providing. Yes, there will be challenges of latency, there will be issues, but ultimately that is where we have to reach seamless communication with satellite providing it to the unserved areas. Two important issues in that presently, which are a challenge or which are issues of regulation are, one is the allocation of spectrum. There's another competitor, very aggressive, looking for spectrum, and that is satellite communication. And the change we have seen is in WRC 23, nearly more than 50% points were on the communication, the spectrum which was required by terrestrial communication and by satellites. So now in India, and preparing for WRC 27, we have to look at it. And most importantly, because today communication has become global, be it satellite communication, be it terrestrial, we have to have light touch policies, and they have to be globally harmonized. We cannot be in the old system or old rules and all. Fortunately, the government is looking that way. We would want it much faster, much more liberal and much more light touch, but the first steps for that are being taken. And last, 2.5 years back, nearly, the government gave an intent, okay, we'll give spectrum for space. And last year in the telecom policy, it was even announced that it will be given by administrative means. But though the satellites are up there, for example, of OneWeb, we cannot provide services in India because they're waiting how much money they have to charge. This is opportunity cost. Industry cannot afford it. New players who will come into this domain, which they are coming into, they will not be able to participate here in India. And we have to have them if we have to go forward. I'll leave it at that.
So great points there, and I was anyway going to ask you about this need for light touch and harmonization. And given that it's considered a very strategic area, B, there are law enforcement concerns on interception and so on. So this becomes, it stays very heavily regulated, and a sat phone is looked at with extreme suspicion and so on. So would you have thoughts on how to approach this? But I'll come back to you on that. Sandeep?
Thanks. Thanks, Prasanto. I've heard a couple of the comments already. So, and the presentation which Dharmendra made a few minutes ago, I think there are two underlying assumptions there. One, the network is everywhere. And two, it is available all the time. And I think when I look back at the industry, and I've been a part of the industry for a long time, it was about 5,000, 6,000, 8,000 base stations way back in early 2000s. To today, which is about 750,000 base stations, give or take, in the country. And it is not stopping here. Just that the density is going to continuously go up. So that brings us to so two key issues, Prasanto, and since you asked for one or two. One, right of way, which has been touched upon, and the right of way is just not about fiber laying around the ground or around the rail track, etc., but it is about availability of smaller sites, street furniture, being able to get permissions in the buildings at a standard rate of speed. Because when we put in all of those applications which have been talked about, they won't wait, or they can't wait for the sites to come up, for the coverage to come up. So that's one. The second one is available all the time. And here, I think the big thing is about availability of power, which has to be 24/7, and it just cannot be without power, because the moment a site fails because of power, we have an issue in terms of availability and so on. And just to give you a perspective, and this is where I would leave the second point for further discussion is, and I'll give you a bit of a data point. I mean, in this room, if I was to ask you to guess that how much diesel is consumed by the towers which the industry has put across the country, I can almost guarantee you that you will be a zero short. You will not be half or a quarter. You will be at least a zero short. And that number is probably in the neighborhood of 500 million liters a year. Yeah, think about it. And this is to keep the network up. So there's a big role which many of the ecosystem players have to play to get rid of that, because that's not just sustainable as we move forward. So I leave you with those two thoughts, Prasanto.
Okay, that's an impressive figure. And obviously, it does bring up the very obvious question of, how does that fit into the net zero and the greening plans? So I want to come back to some of these questions, but at this point, since we have very little time, I also want to see if we have any questions or anything you want us to touch upon in the last 10 minutes of this. So very quickly, if you can have a mic over there, and if you keep it as short as possible, we'll have the maximum time for interaction. Is it possible to get a mic out here?
To enable the digital divide to be overcome by women in India, they see that they don't even have the devices to get their Jan Dhan money. And considering there's such a large fund available through this USO, are there any initiatives to at least get a device to these women and this vulnerable segment, which the government itself has identified?
Okay, so if I can just hold for a second, is there any other, if you can just park that question with you? Okay, fair enough. Let's take this up, and then I want to just address some of the things. And I think, just to add on to that, and we've seen that penetration has gone up and all of that. But in rural areas, for example, the access for women is lower. It's often with, a male member of the household. And so many of these messages which are being sent out to women, on whatever, maternal health, everything, they're actually reaching the wrong gender. So I don't know if is that problem still a significant one, or do you see changes there?
So just going back to, I think one of the, can you hear me? One of the projects that we had run with the USO fund several years ago, which was for women, and what we did find was that while the device or the handset was given to the woman, it was used usually by the male member of the family. So that is indeed a challenge. But coming to what is done in the TBN fund, the scope of the fund has been enlarged. Apart from just talking about connectivity, they've also brought in things like, women, diversity, telecom, startups, etc. So we're hoping that, coupled with schemes from respective ministries, we have seen schemes coming out from the government which are oriented towards women. So definitely the thinking is in that direction on how to solve it. Whether there is absolute, one way to go about it is debatable. But yes, the efforts are underway.
So just one question in general to everybody that, is this being measured okay? Like TRAI has one simple big table which says, this is penetration. And the penetration is total numbers divided by total number of people, which is not accurate because you have multiple ownership in some places and you have deficit in others. So do you think there is a deeper metric which should be used to actually today look at penetration and access?
So I know GSMA does something which is unique subscriber count. I'm not readily sure about how they do it, but those numbers are available and that method.
Okay, so I want to just pick up some of the questions in the last, and we have about 7 minutes. I'll just keep one or two threads. So one is, there is clearly a big focus in policy making on on strategic autonomy, on nation first, and so on. And that covers cybersecurity, that covers the Make in India thrust, localization, all of that. So as far as telecom is concerned, how do we? I mean, it is clearly a tremendously globalized industry. The development, production, manufacturing is kind of worldwide. Nobody makes their own complete own 5G, and we're going to do everything here end to end, etc. That's one question. How do we deal with it as we go in this very globalized world which is being, and this IP question also, if we can take up that, is it actually practical, or is there any better way to encourage a lot more IP coming in here and so on, with the premise that strategic autonomy requires not the manufacturing as much as actually the IP, the software design, etc. But we still haven't really found a great way to do it. We are making a lot of phones, but that's a lot of it is assembly, and you go deeper down, they have to be brought in from outside and so on. So this whole strategic autonomy direction, and for you, sir, General Bhatt, on that question of the concerns on that, and therefore the paranoia about SATCOM, how do you actually get past that? So very quick thoughts on this, anybody? Vinish, you
I'll
want to?
just go
Yeah,
first
please,
with
please go ahead.
the policy and the framework around it.
Yeah.
As with the 5G and massive IoT and everything coming in, numbers are going to increase so much that your ability to actually your framework has to be like security by design, privacy by design. It has to be built into the solution. It cannot be something which is imposed from outside. There is going to be a whole host of things that need to come in, while the framework needs to be light, but it needs to be enabled through solutions that don't require, literally, I would say, manual intervention.
From a ecosystem perspective also, we've got cyber security, privacy regulations, which are only applicable to device manufacturers, which are only applicable to operators. Very different. But look at what, for example, RBI has done. Brought everybody into one umbrella. Whether you're a bank, you're an NBFC, holistic. I think if we also look at a holistic picture end to end, it's not only about, for example, chip manufacturers, right? How do we make one framework, put security by design, privacy by design, as a before thought and not as an afterthought, is what will help from an ecosystem perspective.
I think in my view, this whole localization is a great concept. I mean, absolutely, we all want local companies to come up, manufacture products, telecom, make in India, that's super important, right? But let's be a bit more practical. There has to be some component in the whole chain which probably might not be, made in India. It might never happen. There might be some software, something in the whole chain that might. So does the policy allow, or is it like that is not made in India because that one component is not manufactured over here? So that whole simplification is important, right? Because that is still a bit gray. Number two, there is equal amount of companies which are global multinationals investing over here, manufacturing products, putting in money, R&D labs, doing everything possible. They are as much as make in India that anybody else. But registration of IPR, it's a whole, even the IPR lawyers have not been able to figure out how do you, simplify this, how do you do this, how do you qualify, because it's a lot of complications. A software can be manufactured or developed in 5 different countries for the same product. Right? Hardware can come from multiple places. So there has to be some simple way which can, as much as possible, that, okay, have a design center in India or have X number of 1,000 people over here for a product. Those simple qualifications, I'm sure there are regulators who are thinking about it, but it has to be simplified a bit because otherwise it's just not practical, so to say. And the disadvantage, then what happens is then the competition of these companies in certain projects never happens. And then you're into the state of, less competition, the global products are not here. So it's always the catch-22 situation. I think tough call, but needs to be looked into.
So I think what you're essentially saying also is, give credit and value to R&D base in India, to employment in India, to all of that as also significant contributors to localization, as it were.
Also, see, the Indian products have to go abroad, outside as well, right? So how simple will that be, right? So it has to be looked into both ways.
Yeah. Jaspreet, to your point, I think very interesting point you made on the RBI thing. I think RBI is a very strong regulator in that sector. I don't think we have the exact equivalent here. RBI is almost never taken to court challenging anything. So that the other thing they do is, of course, they have regulated entities, and everybody else is supposed to operate with those regulated entities, and those REs are responsible for, like NPCI is responsible for Google Pay's compliance, etc., etc. So there are some challenges in that comparison. But yeah, I'll come back to that. So just your thoughts on this strategic autonomy and the, the space, the paranoia.
I'll give you one successful example of strategic autonomy. And that was not by choice. It happened because the ITR regulations were imposed on us. And I'm talking about space. After the peaceful nuclear tests which we carried out, there were very stringent IPR and ITR laws which were imposed on us. Literally, I would say our space program would have come to a grinding halt. But what it resulted in is finding solutions within the country. And what has been the outcome of it? That when the first private sector rocket has now been launched, the 40 suppliers to that private company were from India. Yes, there was pain for this to happen. ISRO had to do many things for the technology to come, but ultimately, after a lag of 10 years or something, they've come. So that is the advantage. That is the major picture. But the other thing is, do we lose out all good technology because we are saying only Atmanirbhar? There has to be a practical end to it. And if you see, if the same government which says Atmanirbhar produced in India also says FDI 100%, FDI 74% in defense, it is tolerance for ambiguity we have to have for the grey. There is no perfect solution which anybody can provide. That's what I'll leave it to.
Terrific. I think we don't really have time for more questions. I just want to take up this last bit on the strategic autonomy, well, not the strategy, the shared infrastructure, which both of you have one way or the other alluded, and you, of course, part of the sector. This sector has shown great stuff that can be done with shared infrastructure. We couldn't have done what we had without it. Do we need to look beyond with other sectors to look at, not just rights of way, but energy, for example, renewable energy in terms of shared infrastructure? We're talking about this India, Middle East, Europe, Africa pipeline, which will be a pipeline of fiber and hydrogen gas and all kinds of things from the G20. Okay, is there a case for actually looking at shared infrastructure beyond telecom and across sectors? Any thoughts on that, Anjali, Sandeep?
Thanks. So I think, again, the Telecom Act does talk about common ducts. So the government is already thinking along those lines to say that we understand that there will be, electricity and telecom fiber, which needs to be there. So I think the foundation has been laid. Again, the details need to come out.
Yeah. I think the argument for more and more sharing is always valid, and I think it will continue to be even more powerful as we go forward. But the sharing is one sharing of the same resource between different sort of entities and could come from different industries. The second part, which is around sharing, is that many of the areas now we are moving into are starting to fall on the boundaries or the overlap of multiple government entities. So the example of power, I will just work on that one for a minute. While providing energy to the telecom operators is a telecom ministry topic maybe, but the energy is a power or the renewable energy topic. So I think there is more dimensions to sharing than just the one which we have generally been talking about. And that's where I would leave the thought. I could elaborate more, but given the time, I'll just stop here.
Okay, thank you so much. We are out of time, but terrific conversation, and I think we'll be able to converge some of the points that have emerged from this and do something good with it. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the panel. Can I just request the panel to be on stage and invite Himanshu Gupta from HPE India to present the mementos to our panelists.